Welcome back. It's time now for the France 24 debate. And the Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, is currently on a 3-day visit to France, where he's been given a red carpet welcome from President Emmanuel Macron, underscoring the close alliance between Cairo and Paris. Well, the Egyptian presidency says that both nations wish to pursue their strategic relations, and the two leaders are understood to have been discussing numerous regional and international issues. But not everyone is pleased to see these two men standing side by side. Rights groups have branded President Sisi a dictator, and they point to the fact that there are currently 60,000 prisoners of conscience in Egypt at this very moment. Well, even so, President Macron said today that he's not going to be making Egypt's human rights record a condition for the sale of weapons to that country. Let's listen to what both presidents had to say a little earlier on Monday.
Je ne conditionnerai pas notre coopération en matière de défense comme en matière économique à ces désaccords. D'abord parce que je crois à la souveraineté des peuples et au respect de nos intérêts légitimes et réciproques. Ensuite parce que je pense qu'il est plus efficace d'avoir une politique de dialogue exigeant qu'une politique de boycott qui viendrait réduire l'efficacité d'un de nos partenaires dans la lutte contre le terrorisme et pour la stabilité régionale. Donc ce serait inefficace sur le sujet des droits de l'homme et contre-productif dans la lutte contre le terrorisme. C'est pour ça que je ne le ferai pas.
The truth is that the statement that Egypt is an oppressive state is inappropriate. It is not appropriate for you to present the Egyptian state, with everything it does for its people and for the stability of the region, as an oppressive regime. This view of the Egyptian state belongs in the past.
Okay, the Egyptian president speaking there, and before them, the French President Emmanuel Macron saying it would be counterproductive to make human rights issues one of the conditions for arms sales. So, is President Macron being too lenient on his Egyptian guest with this issue of human rights? And what is the state of Paris-Cairo relations? And what are the objectives of this visit? Those are just some of the questions we're going to be answering today with our guests. We're joined from London by Dr. Maher Azam, who is the head of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council. That's a platform which promotes a democratic and civil state in Egypt. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We're joined from Barcelona by Timothy Caldas, who is a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. I would like to start by asking you, Dr. Maher Azam, a quote from an Amnesty International report. It says here that Egypt has become, and I quote, an open-air prison for critics. Just tell us how bad things are, in your opinion.
The situation is critical in Egypt and has been so since 2013. The human rights situation has deteriorated year after year. We have over 60,000 political prisoners. We have reports from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty showing that torture is systematic. We have executions that have taken place, over 30 in the last month of October. We have disappearances of political dissidents. Egypt is an open-air prison. Journalists are arrested on the list of Reporters Without Borders. Egypt features, I believe, 166 out of 180 countries. The situation is dismal. There is no freedom of assembly, no freedom of speech. There is no other way to describe Egypt except as an authoritarian state under Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. So, in a sense, the opportunity was lost today by President Macron to really put some pressure on the dictator in Egypt and to uphold the values that France espouses.
Thank you. Let me turn to Barcelona and ask Timothy Caldas. In your opinion, is President Macron wrong, therefore, to be welcoming President Sisi with open arms and a red carpet?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it sends a signal that the issues that Macron has raised around human rights, both during this visit and in previous visits, both to Cairo and Sisi coming to Paris in the past, are not central concerns of the Élysée. And so the reality is that there's no reason that France is required to hold a state visit and welcome Sisi with open arms with this red carpet treatment. They can have diplomatic relations and engage on the pressing issues for both of their countries without this sort of fanfare. I think that sort of welcome should be reserved for people who meet a certain standard, who do not oversee states that engage in torture and mass imprisonment of political dissidents.
But President Macron seems to have an argument here, which is that if there's no dialogue, there's no opportunity to privately apply pressure. And President Macron maintains that, yes, pressure is applied behind closed doors, but he's obviously made a bit of a call here with regard to the psychology of President Sisi, who perhaps won't take kindly to being lectured in public by the French president. That's the argument from the Élysée. Do you buy it? Let me ask you, Dr. Azam, pardon.
It seems that from what we heard from the speech of President Macron is he's really letting President Sisi off the hook completely. In a sense, trade as usual, military sales as usual, investments, all this has been used really. It's the carrot that Sisi has given France to silence it on human rights. And I believe even if there has been mention of human rights behind closed doors, the statements that Macron has made publicly are ones that really give a green light to President Sisi to more or less carry on as he is. And this is a shame after really what happened just days ago with the arrest of the EIPR staff. Yes, they were let go, their assets just a few days ago, their assets are frozen, and they are a symbol of what is happening in Egypt, throughout Egypt, and they are only part of the story, which is a very ugly one in terms of human rights violations.
But President Macron's approach isn't new.
If I could also just add,
go for it. Jump in.
I just think that there's a false dichotomy being presented by President Macron, whereas the options are either full embrace, red carpet treatment, state visit, or boycott and a suspension of communication. And that's not necessarily the case. France can continue to engage with Egypt on a number of issues. It has many channels through which it can do so. But the reality is that without conditionality, the message being sent by Macron is that the French government does not prioritize these issues of rights. And from the perspective of Cairo, there's a widely held belief that these issues of raising human rights have more to do with appeasing domestic audiences in France than they do with actual central concerns of the French government.
Yeah, but I mean, should we be surprised that the president hasn't said, yes, I'll do what I've been asked to do by a group of human rights bodies that have written this open letter saying he shouldn't, he should raise this issue? Because last time President Sisi came to Paris in October of 2017, President Macron said, I won't lecture Egypt on liberties. So why would we expect him to do it this time? Dr. Azam.
I don't think we expect him to.
It seems to me it's not about an open letter. We know that the UNHCR has also condemned what's happening in Egypt. We've heard condemnations from Calamar, the rapporteur on executions at the UN. It's various human rights bodies and United Nations organizations. The European Parliament in the past has condemned what's happening in Egypt. So it's not about responding to one open letter, even though that represents a reality on the ground. The fact is that Mr. Macron, I would go further. It's not that he put aside the issue of human rights and didn't address it. He has actually helped in enabling Sisi to carry on with what he's doing. He has become an enabler of the violations in Egypt because there needs to be, the situation is not black and white, as my colleague has said, but no, it would have been a chance for France to show leadership in this issue of human rights violations, and on the contrary, it has failed abysmally, and in a sense it has underscored the reality, and that is that trade and interests come before human rights in the region, in the Middle East region.
Timothy Callis, you wanted to jump in. I'm sorry, we cut you off.
No problem at all. I just think that the question presumes that we expected Macron to behave differently. I think the actual reality is that, unfortunately, a lot of people didn't expect him to behave differently and didn't expect him to commit to materially supporting the values that he speaks of all the time and he claims are his values. I think that the reality is that short of conditionality, short of attaching a material consequence to these rights violations, it's difficult to take him seriously. But no, I don't think that the expectation was he was going to respond positively at all to this letter. Unfortunately, the Egyptians didn't expect that either, which is why after the U.S. started to hold back some military assistance in 2013, we see an increase in purchases from France. And the reason the U.S. had started to hinder those purchases in 2013 was over the gross human rights violations that took place then, particularly the massacre in Rabat, where nearly 1,000 people were killed, according to Human Rights Watch. And I think that the Egyptian government has concluded that the French government will exercise less scrutiny over their arms purchases, and so they've sought to diversify and include the French and the Russians and others in their arms purchases so as to avoid anyone being able to hold them to account.
Yeah, I mean, there must be some concern here in Paris that perhaps all of this could one day come back to haunt President Macron, because a recent French parliamentary report on arms sales highlights reputational damage and increasingly the political cost that France could end up incurring longer term if this country continues to sell surveillance technology and arms to Egypt. Do you both agree, therefore, it sounds like you do, that perhaps this is all going to come back to haunt President Macron and this country at a later stage? Timothy Callis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, unfortunately, France has historically had a reputation of being willing to sell weapons to a lot of unsavory characters around the world. And this is one example of that. And I think that while President Macron has also painted a very unrealistic picture that indeed has helped President Sisi justify his repression, because he contextualized his comments on the issue of human rights around issues of security and issues of stability. And the reality is that the repression that is being undertaken by the Egyptian government is not promoting security. Quite the contrary. Imprisoning peaceful political critics alongside terrorists has created a situation in which Egyptian prisons can be sites for radicalization of people who have otherwise pursued their opposition peacefully. Moreover, the repression and the scale of the repression has created an enormous amount of tension in Egypt and no safe, peaceful mechanism for expressing that tension. And so there is a continual fear that protests could spin out of control, which is a fear that is shared by the Egyptian government, which is why you see them reacting so overwhelmingly when a few thousand people across the country, in a country of 100 million people, protest. In a country like France, in a country like in any other democratic state, a few thousand people out of 100 million people protesting wouldn't be cause for alarm. But when you have tied the screws so tightly, it creates this type of fragility that allows such a small thing to be so significant.
Dr. Azam, your thoughts? Could this come back to haunt President Macron?
I think it's a recipe for instability. It's not about just the sale of arms. President Macron is supporting a dictatorship that essentially represents a minority, a dictatorship that has pursued the iron fist policy in order to survive. And it's understandable that dictatorships use the issue of security and fighting terrorism in order to justify human rights violations, and for it to be a catch-all phrase for military trials of political dissidents, for imprisoning all sorts of political dissidents from different political trends. All that is part of not only the discourse but the practice of dictatorship. But why should a president of a democratic country like France partake in this? That is the question I pose. Why should the president of France be talking about the fight against extremism, which is absolutely acceptable, and the fight against terrorism, but using it as an umbrella to include political opposition of all sorts, peaceful and even non-Islamists. That is what Sisi is doing, and President Macron is using the same sort of discourse, which entails an attack on civil liberties, an attack on any kind of freedom of assembly or freedom of expression in Egypt. Egypt is essentially a country where there are the voices of the opposition are clamped down on, and we see the repercussions every day of people being imprisoned and tortured. Mr. Macron represents a democracy. He should not have gone down that path. He could have done more during this visit and opened the door for more pressure on Sisi. This is a recipe for less stability than France would ever want in the region, not more stability.
Okay, we've got a third guest who's just joining us now from Cairo. We're joined by Ayman Aboulayla, who is from the Franco-Egyptian Parliamentary Friendship Group. Thank you for joining us at this late stage of the discussion. We're just talking about the dismal state, to quote my guests, of human rights in Egypt right now. And we're discussing whether President Macron is wrong to be welcoming your president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, in Paris with such open arms. What are your thoughts?
I think that the relation between Egypt and France is very good relation, historical relation. And the relation between the two presidents is very transparent and obvious for everything. Always when you go to Europe, you hear about one thing, the human rights. I don't know why. Like all Egyptians are in prisons, everybody is out of order, cannot speak. I can talk with you in any subject now, and this is for the wrong ideas which is sought in many human rights publicity in your country. This is why this repetition is not right, because we have perhaps some other definition for human rights for the time being, because we are still surrounded by territories where there is quarrels and wars, and the terrorism is around us inside our country. Thus, you cannot measure your human rights with our human rights. I have heard in your introduction that a lot of people are in the prison without any cause, without any reason. This is not right. We have the Human Rights Committee in our parliament which interfere in each president and know each subject in this situation. Thus, I'm astonished about your idea about the human rights and the bad human rights in Egypt.
Okay, you've had the last word for this first half of the debate. We're going to be back very shortly, though, and I'm sure our other guests would like to react to what you've said. So do stay with us, everybody. We'll be right back after this short break. It is time now for part two of the France 24 debate. We're discussing the visit to France by the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who's been given a warm welcome with pomp, drum rolls, trumpets, and a Republican Guard cavalry escort through the centre of Paris, and then a red carpet welcome into the Élysée Palace by President Emmanuel Macron. But rights groups have branded Sisi a dictator, and they call his leadership repressive. Well, France seems to be arguing that even so, Egypt's human rights record is not a precondition for the sale of weapons, and that more can be done and more can be achieved if communication channels are kept open. Well, we're joined from London by Dr. Maha Azam, who's the head of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council. That's a platform promoting democratic and civil state in Egypt. We're joined from Barcelona by Timothy Caldas, a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. And we're joined by Ayman Aboulayla from the Franco-Egyptian Parliamentary Friendship Group, who joins us from Cairo. Just before the break, we were getting Mr. Abouleila's opinion on the state of human rights in Egypt, which differs quite largely, I would say, from what we were hearing in the first half. Could I start by asking Dr. Maher Azam to react to Mr. Abouleila's interpretation of the situation regarding human rights in Egypt today?
Clearly, it contradicts, let me not say what the Egyptian opposition say, but it contradicts what leading officials of the United Nations say, whether it's Ms. Bachelet, whether it's Ms. Kalama. It contradicts the most reputable of human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and an array of other organizations. Clearly, those that support the military dictatorship in Egypt weave a different story, a different discourse, but the reality is for all to see. We have over 60,000 political prisoners. Civil society is trampled on in Egypt, and the reality is this is a military dictatorship where people are not allowed freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, journalists are imprisoned. It's a dire state of affairs for anyone who wants to see political opening up in Egypt, let alone democracy. Since 2013, Egypt, in front of the world, in the front of all the world leaders, was seen as what it was. The Sisi came to power on the back of a tank, and he spoke of a roadmap to democracy. It's been a roadmap to dictatorship. Nothing more, nothing less, just pure authoritarianism and dictatorship. And what comes with it is severe repression, because he needs to stay in power. There are economic interests that need to be assured for an elite that is in power and that is corrupt. That is the real story, and it's the story that Mr. Macron, President Macron, I am sure knows well. But ultimately, he wants business for France after the economic situation, the dire economic situation in France and in the world with COVID, and he's willing to carry on doing business with the dictator. But I still insist that he could have been far more forceful on the issue of human rights. And the reality is that even if we say, talking behind closed doors is more efficient, my question again is, why hasn't it been efficient since the last time they met? They've been talking about behind closed doors since 2019, 2017. Well, the human rights situation has deteriorated, and it will continue to deteriorate if President Macron and others like him continue to court Sisi, the dictator.
Okay, Mr. Abouleila, I'm going to give you a chance to respond in just a second. I'd also just like to ask Mr. Timothy Caldas for his opinions, because we haven't heard from him for a while. What are your thoughts, Mr. Caldas?
I think, respectfully, Mr. Abouleila's position that Egypt is a free country is completely untenable. When there was a constitutional referendum recently that in part would extend President Sisi's ability to stay in power until as late as 2030, one individual stood in Tahrir Square with a sign calling on people to vote no, and he was immediately arrested and thrown in prison. There were virtually no signs anywhere to be seen in Egypt encouraging anyone to vote no. No one was allowed to take an opposite position to that of the government. The presidential election that Sisi held in 2018, every single candidate that was seriously running against him was either arrested or driven out of the campaign, to the point where they were at risk of having President Sisi run against himself. And so they brought in Mustafa Musa, who was actually supporting President Sisi before this, to be the candidate to stand against him. And he came in third in the two-person race because spoiled ballots got more votes than Mustafa Musa did. The President Sisi reportedly got 97% of the vote. So this is not a democracy. It is not a free country. There's no freedom of assembly and there's no freedom of speech. That's the reality in Egypt. Now, if you want to defend that because you think that that's the right way to go about things, fine, but be honest about what's the situation.
Okay, let me just turn back to Mr. Abouleila, just looking at what Reporters Without Borders says, not what any of us are saying in this forum. In terms of the world, let me just ask you this question. In terms of the World Press Freedom Index, Egypt ranks 163 out of 180 countries. I mean, there has to be some degree of truth in what we've been hearing, mustn't there?
Listen, first of all, I don't understand to go in debate in a debate with a person said that this dictator, from what he is based on to say this definition, actually, perhaps if we are building our country, sir, we are building Egypt. I invite her to come. If she can come, because she is escaping, but if she can come in Egypt to see how we are building our country with new streets, with new buildings, with new people, and building people, which is important about health, education, and everything. But this situation that we are talking about, people in prison, come and prove it. Come and prove it. There is nothing of this. She told, the other guest told you that this assembly is not a choosing assembly. And he told you that Sisi came another time by a way to extend the constitution to 2030. This is not right. This is what Muslim Brotherhood said to you. The truth is there is another election. If there is a power in front of Sisi, come to be elected another time as a president and support Egypt. This is not right. You are talking about one side. What Muslim Brotherhood said in your media.
Okay, no, I was quoting Reporters Without Borders. I'll quote another body for you. Amnesty International last week talking about a horrifying execution spree in Egypt. 57 men and women have been put to death in the last 2 months, almost double the total of the whole of last year. I mean, that sounds repressive by anybody's standards, surely.
57 in prison.
I'm sorry?
In prison.
No, executed. Executed?
This is not right. From where? Give me proof.
Amnesty International didn't pull that number out of a hat.
I am a deputy. I am a parliamentman. Give me the names. I will check it, and I swear to you to give you the exact number. Give you the names.
I'm sure those names and numbers are readily available from Amnesty International, which is known for being quite rigorous.
Let be given in the media, and we check it. Don't give me directly. Let the Human Rights Watch give us this number in the media, and we will check it. This is not right. This is what Muslim Brotherhood said to you, and you believe it. I don't know why.
No, I haven't been speaking to the Muslim Brotherhood, but let's ask our other guests to react. Go for it, Mr. Caldas.
Please, yes. Every single time there's any serious criticism of anything the Egyptian government does, the response of the government is to call it some sort of conspiracy by the Muslim Brotherhood. It's completely absurd and untenable. It's gotten to the point where it's a joke in Egypt, where people jokingly pretend like every time something bad happens, they say, oh, it must have been the Brotherhood, because it's become such a tired refrain by the government. When there's flooding in Alexandria, they blame the Brotherhood. When there was a currency crisis, they blame the Brotherhood. It's a constant refrain. It has no basis in reality. The Brotherhood also was bad at governing, but they're gone right now. And Sisi's been in power for 7 years. So the problems in Egypt are his problems. And the idea that every single thing that is ever said critical of the regime is the Brotherhood is completely baseless and completely untenable. And I wish you would at least come up with a new lie, just once, because frankly, it's getting tired.
We need proof.
And beyond that,
we need proof. We need proof, sir, for this.
Sorry?
He's asking for proof. What's the proof, for example?
Proof. What are you talking about? Emmanuel Macron today said that they got political prisoners freed from Egypt. Are you calling the president of France a liar too? Because he said it today, standing next to Sisi.
I think if you return back, I can say to you that in Gilets Jaunes there is 2,000 people in prison now. I'm right. I need a proof to say
they're political prisoners, and are you calling the president of France a liar for saying there are political prisoners?
No. Don't make me in this situation, please. I don't say anything about.
I'm asking you a question.
I'm saying President Macron, like everybody, needs to give us proofs and names. This is what we are talking about.
He did.
Give us
Rami Shath. He said Rami Shath in the press conference. Did you watch the press conference? He named Rami Shath as one of the political prisoners. The political prisoners from the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, Karima Nara, Ghasser Abdel Rezzaq, and Mohammed Bashir, that were just released but are still facing terrorism charges These are people who the French government consults with. Are you claiming that the French government is consulting with people who work with terrorists?
No,
is that what you're claiming?
Not right. No, you're not
okay,
right.
then they shouldn't be in terrorism court, right? Is that what you're saying? So it's wrong that they're in terrorism court. Their assets shouldn't be frozen. Is that what you're saying?
There is law. There is legal way. There is legal way to say this is terrorist or this is
no,
human
because
rights.
When they went to court to get their assets unfrozen, the judge wouldn't let the defense speak. There was no legal process. There was no due process. This just happened.
I think
you keep saying rule of law, but we're not seeing it.
All right. Well, I think we're going to have some disagreement here. Let's take a look at the broader state of relations between Paris and Cairo. France 24's Peter O'Brien has prepared this report for us.
Back in October 2017, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi first met Emmanuel Macron, who'd been elected 5 months prior. Macron kept it sweet with the Egyptian president, refusing to criticise him in front of the press, notably on the issue of human rights.
De la même façon que je n'accepte qu'aucun autre dirigeant me donne des leçons sur la manière de gouverner mon pays, je n'en donne pas aux autres.
At the same time, several NGOs were already condemning the worst human rights crisis in Egypt in decades, pointing to mass arrests, death sentences and widespread torture. Egypt is, however, strategically useful to France in the region in its fight against terrorism. And with billions of euros worth of French military equipment sold to Egypt, including battleships and Rafale fighter jets, France has become one of Egypt's top arms suppliers.
La France a vendu depuis plusieurs années du matériel de surveillance, des armes. Nos rapports ont démontré combien et comment ce matériel était utilisé par les autorités égyptiennes pour réprimer des manifestations.
In January 2019, Emmanuel Macron went to Cairo, where unexpectedly he did raise the question of human rights.
La recherche de stabilité, de sécurité qui nous anime ne saurait être dissociée de la question des droits de l'homme.
This shift in rhetoric weighed on relations between the two countries.
مفيش دولة في العالم أو مفيش ممكن يبقى في العالم كله يسير على نهج واحد ويقول إن هو ده النهج الأفضل والأمثل ما نقدرش نقول كده.
Just before al-Sisi's arrival in Paris on Sunday, Egypt did release 3 human rights workers from jail. It's estimated that 60,000 detainees in Egypt today are political prisoners.
Okay, so just before we move on to the broader issue of bilateral relations and shared interests and so on, let's just conclude the human rights subject with Dr. Maha Azam. I just want to ask you, because you were very quiet during that last exchange, let's just conclude. What would you like to see President Macron do or say before the Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, heads back to Cairo?
I think anyone who is concerned with human rights anywhere in the world would call for the release of all political prisoners, call for freedom of assembly and freedom of expression in Egypt. Those are 3 very basic demands or requests. Freedom of all political prisoners, freedom of assembly, and freedom of expression. None of these are available in Egypt, and a moratorium on executions. You mentioned how many were executed according to Amnesty International in 2 months. Around 57 people, I believe the number is. That is, we've reached a critical point, a brutal point in terms of the human rights situation in Egypt. And surely the president of a democratic country like France can do better than just do business and give the green light to Sisi. There needs to be a much stronger hand, because otherwise we're going to see an escalation of the violations, not a moratorium on anything, but rather never an escalation. The release of the EIPR staff is most welcome. It was welcomed by every one of us. But in reality, they know, the EIPR staff, and we know there are 60,000 political prisoners who face torture and slow death because of negligence in Egypt's prisons. And every free voice in Egypt, you don't even have to be highly politicized. If you put a wrong post on a Facebook, you're liable possibly to be picked up. If you make a statement that it doesn't conform to the government, or you happen to be among a small group of people that gathered in the last few months to demonstrate, you're thrown into prison. There's no such thing for people who have spoken out and have been politically active to go back to Egypt. They're liable to be thrown in prison and tortured. Egypt is a dangerous place. And Mr. Cameron, President Cameron, knows this. Selling arms and more arms may be good for the French economy, but ultimately it's not good for stability if there is no conditionality.
Okay, let's just look more broadly at sort of Cairo's strategy here, because, of course, there's a change of guard on the horizon in the United States. And I'm just wondering if perhaps President Sisi is looking around the world and building up some existing alliances. After all, President Trump called Abdel Fattah al-Sisi a fantastic guy. President Trump, again, to quote him, says, "We agree on so many things. I just want to let everyone know, in case there's any doubt, that we are very much behind President al-Sisi. He's done a fantastic job in a very difficult situation." Do we think that the administration of Joe Biden might perhaps be less supportive of President Sisi? Could I ask you for your thoughts, Timothy Caldas?
Yeah, there are clearly indications that the Biden administration intends to be much less accommodating for the level of repression that is currently in Egypt. We saw the nominee for Secretary of State come out and criticize the arrests of the human rights workers at the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, Anthony Blinken. We've seen statements by others who are close to the Biden administration, such as Senator Coons, make similar statements. The Democrats in general have been quite critical, and historically, we've seen a degree of concern in Congress about the rights situation that is growing. And we're seeing it in the hearings that are being held in Congress. We're seeing it in the committees. We're seeing it in the statements by individual members. And in the past, the president has sort of protected Egypt a bit from this criticism out of Congress. If the Biden administration is unwilling to do so, then Congress could mobilize to apply a lot more pressure on Egypt and start to downgrade the amount of assistance that Egypt receives. So, it seems that that President Sisi realizes this, which is why, for example, the relatives of Mohammed Sultan, an American citizen who was in Egyptian prison and tortured, were released. They had previously been held to pressure Sultan to drop a case against a number of Egyptian officials over his torture in Egyptian prison. But they were released, presumably in an effort to signal goodwill. And this came immediately after it was clear that Biden had won the election. They've also hired a lobbying firm that includes the former chief of staff of the Speaker of the House. And they're clearly working on trying to improve their image. But these incidents still creep up, like the arrest of the EIPR workers. And they need to have a more coherent strategy on how to improve the situation so that the Biden administration doesn't apply more pressure.
Mr. Abu Layla, in Cairo, let me ask you from the point of view of someone in Cairo, what do you think is the feeling about the change of guard in Washington? Do you think people in Egypt feel that the relationship with the United States, which is, of course, a powerful ally of Egypt's, will be different under President Joe Biden?
I don't think so, because the political way of United States don't depend on people, depend on strategy. And this is why I want to explain that in Egypt, again, put yourself in a situation, you have terrorism inside your country, in the frontier, imported people inside your country, and a lot of problems in the region and inside your country, in Sinai, in explosions and everything. At the same time, you are asking that now everything will go in a complete way of professional executive freedom. Yes, perhaps there is many mistakes in the start of 2014, but now again we are building our own country. We are helping everybody to say his words, his name, and to express himself. This is why I need the people who are talking about what's going in Egypt to come near Egypt. And again, those names, I don't know those numbers, 60,000 political prisoners. I think this is very exaggerated numbers.
Okay, well, that's, as we've been saying, it's an Amnesty International figure, not one that we've pulled out of thin air. Let's go back to talking about geopolitical relations, though. Please, jump in.
Can I address this question of terrorism? I agree that Egypt has a terrorism problem that is challenging and that they are in the middle of fighting. And I think that it's a huge waste of resources to prosecute peaceful critics in terrorism courts and to have the security apparatus monitoring peaceful dissidents and arresting them and persecuting them. And this is a waste of resources when Egypt has an urgent problem in terms of fighting terrorism. I agree, and it's important. And we should see Egypt focus its resources on actually targeting that problem and focusing on people who are actually violent. But arresting peaceful researchers who meet with European governments to talk about human rights is a waste of those resources and distracts from that goal.
Indeed, and the Office of the UN Human Rights Commissioner says that the use of counter-terrorism and national security legislation is something that's used to silence dissent, and therefore it's being abused. So that comes from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. I just want to ask another issue. Go ahead, Dr. Azam.
No, I just think as a follow-up to Timothy, I mean, we must remember also the death of the postgraduate student, the doctoral student Giulio Regini, and how the Italians are now trying to get to the bottom of what happened. He was tortured and killed in Egypt. We have others, so many in prison, but his case came to light as something that was horrific, but is actually testimony to similar cases that have happened throughout Egypt. He was neither a member of a militant organization, he was not a terrorist, he was picked up, tortured and killed. A Cambridge student who really had nothing to do, he went to Egypt for his research, who had nothing to do with the politics of extremism. So in reality, this catch-all phrase of fighting terrorism and extremism, I hope that sophisticated governments like that of France and the United States can see through this and ultimately be able to distinguish between terrorism and what it is and free expression by groups that just want freedom in their countries.
Okay, well, Dr. Maher Azam, you've had the last word in this debate because we're unfortunately out of time. I had hoped to move on from human rights and talk more about geopolitical ties, but we don't have any more time. So thank you very much indeed to you. Thank you also to Timothy Caldas. I'm sorry, we're out of time. Timothy Caldas, thank you very much indeed to you. Ayman Abu Layla, thank you very much for your contribution from Cairo. That was the France 24 debate.